This is lecture 281-7, Shakespeare and Magnusson. You'll notice in the PDF I gave you of the Magnusson, which you shouldn't have read yet, there are actually two chapters, two essays in that one PDF. The first is very optional. It's not by Magnusson. It is the introduction to the book that includes Magnusson's piece as a chapter. It's called Historical Pragmatics, What It Is and How to Do It. It's by Tevitsainen and Fitzmaurice. If you're interested in knowing more about Magnusson's methodology, you should read through it on your own time if you wish, and particularly if your CSP group ends up writing on the sonnets in a way that engages with Magnusson, you might want to look through it, but it is very optional. I bring it up now and I include it because it would be useful for me, or will be useful for me, to summarize some working definitions that I paraphrase here from the Tevitsainen and Fitzmaurice. So here we go. These are three terms that I'll be using and that Magnusson is using in her piece as well. The first is historical linguistics. That is simply the study of changes to language over time. This is something that Professor Percy also does in her work, you'll remember. Then there's pragmatics. Now let me zoom in on this. Pragmatics, at least as a subfield of linguistics, is the data-driven and empirical study of the way meaning depends on context, on speaker, on situation, interaction, and social function. Rather than a dictionary entry for an independent meaning, pragmatics as a subfield of linguistics looks at how meaning works when it depends, or as far as it depends, on context, speaker, situation, interaction, and social function. Historical pragmatics, you can see it brings those two together, is the data-driven study of how past utterances depend for meaning on large-scale trends in past contexts, speakers, situations, interactions, and social functions, and of how those elements have changed over time. Right, so rather than approaching language change in terms of broad trends independent of those social elements, historical pragmatics looks at those social elements. So that should clarify then how we're going to approach the Magnusson today and how Magnusson moves forward. So the book edited by Tevitsainen and Fitzmaurice, by the way, and that's, hold on before I move on. The book edited by Tevitsainen and Fitzmaurice, by the way, in which the Magnusson essay that you're reading is a chapter, is a science book. It's a science book for linguists by linguists, and linguistics is a science. We haven't discussed tone much yet in this class. Tone is one of our later units. But I want to pause here on what scientific or even scientistic tone can be. Take a look at the Tevitsainen and Fitzmaurice in your PDF, just briefly. Take a look at how it reads. It would be acceptable, this writing, in a science publication, right? But not so much in writing about literature. It strikes the wrong tone. I leave it to students of the sciences to evaluate the Tevitsainen and Fitzmaurice article in terms of its efficacy as academic writing in that field. But I bring it up because that's what I'm impressed by first in the Magnusson that you're going to read. The Magnusson is in the book that essay introduces. And you'll notice how well Magnusson bridges styles. She is writing to linguists first, as well as to us. So for those of you asking how to bridge or make sense of gaps in writing practice and tonal practice between the sciences and the humanities, I offer Lynn Magnusson's excellent work as one object lesson in that. I encourage you to ask Professor Magnusson more about how she straddles fields when she comes and speaks with us. So, I left you at the end of my last lecture on innovation with the 3 Ds of innovative citation. When you cite a secondary source, you should be, almost every time, disagreeing with, deepening, or destabilizing that source. Making clear how you're doing so using signal phrases and thoughtful citation. In order to testify to the power of those 3 Ds as an approach, and of how deeply assumed that kind of approach to sources is assumed at the core of professional writing about literature, I'm going to use this lecture to offer an imaginary reconstruction of how Professor Lynn Magnusson might have arrived at the creation of the work you're reading without much prior knowledge of Shakespeare or of historical pragmatics, other than you might bring to a class on that subject, so assuming she's writing from an undergraduate perspective. The first time I presented this reconstruction, Professor Magnusson was very very cautiously informed me and us that my imaginary reconstruction of that process is not at all true to how it actually happened. One important detail is that she came to this subject herself with a wealth of prior knowledge on the subject. And she also came to the subject with an invitation from a panel organizer at the MLA, the Modern Language Association Conference, to speak specifically on this kind of reading of Shakespeare. But she agrees, and I hope you will, that the kind of imaginative reconstruction that I'm presenting is instructive indeed. The idea of how you might come to what Magnusson is arguing innovatively by virtue of asking questions of your sources and working with disagreeing, deepening, and destabilizing. So, let's start as a student starts, with a close reading of the first 20 sonnets. Let's say a student has gone through a really, really in-depth close reading of the first 20 sonnets of Shakespeare and revealed that, whoa, Shakespeare says thou, thee, and thy so often that when he switches to you or your, it's jarring. Right? That's something that if you had enough time and paid enough attention to the 20 sonnets you were assigned to write on the 20 sonnets, you would notice, right? Because you're noticing every word, and you notice that actually he uses words that to you should mean roughly the same thing, but he switches between them and he uses one pretty consistently until he suddenly doesn't. So, I'll give you two options, right? Boop, boop. Do you write your essay now? Is that enough? Or do you research? Boop. Let's see research, right? It's not enough just to close read. Let's contextualize our close reading. Aha! If I look in the OED, says the researcher, I find that in the 16th century, thou is used towards social inferiors or children, or to others to mark either intimacy or contempt. Now, that isn't really enough research. Let me learn more. Okay, and so I looked further beyond the OED gets me started, into how scholars before me have understood the thou-you variation in 16th century English. Ah, I learn. The dominant understanding of thou-you variation is still what is called the power solidarity model of why to use thou and why to use you, which is articulated by Roger Brown, and this is me quoting Magnusson, articulated by Roger Brown and Albert Gilman originally, and then modified over the years to account for evanescent shifting in terms of politeness, emotion, and other factors, right? So there I am. Now I have an answer, right? Shakespeare uses thou and then suddenly switches to you, and that's explained by the power solidarity model articulated by Brown and Gilman. So there I am. Do I write the essay now, or do I return to the text? You'll see here before my prompt was, do I write the essay now or do I research? Now I've researched, now do I write the essay now or do I return to the text? I'm offering you the process of your essay writing as a back and forth and back and forth. You do the close reading first. The close reading drives you to research. You do the research. The research drives you back to close reading. You do the close reading, etc., etc. Let's see how many times we need to do this. So let's hit boop. No, let's close read. That's not enough. Okay, so close reading reveals, when we go back to the sonnets with the power solidarity model, that is the opposite of how they're used in the sonnets. The sonnet doesn't actually use them for power and solidarity in the way we would expect. She writes, Magnusson writes, these thou-you choices apparently invert expectations. The modified power solidarity model that she found in her research would predict that you would use the initial you address to register the status of the patron. Shakespeare's writing his sonnets to a high-ranking patron, but then he becomes more familiar and even insulting in the sonnets. So he predicts we would predict in the power solidarity model that we would use the initial you address to register the status of the patron, and then there's a subsequent shift to thou to register intense affect, increased intimacy. But what actually happens in the sonnets is it goes in reverse order. We start with one, as we said, and move to the other when we get to intense affect and increased intimacy. So that's weird. So I guess that's weird, right? Ta-da! Yes, ta-da! I have done a close reading that has revealed that the evidence in the sonnets actually cuts against the power solidarity model that I arrived at in research when I first noted there's a switch between thou and you in the sonnets. Essay done. Wait a minute. Boop! Research. I hope that this is not obnoxious. I'm really enjoying the technical things. Maybe I could figure out a more technological way to do it than just going boop. But anyway, boop. Let's do more research. That's a big surprise to describe, or rather, that's a big surprise to say that Shakespeare's sonnets, which are of course a very obvious example of early modern writing, should cut so strongly against what is generally received as the dominant understanding of how thou and you are used. That's a big surprise. Has anyone noticed that before? Ah, they have. So you, close reader, are not the first to notice that there is an unexpected reversal of what we would expect in thou and you. In fact, Gur and Bousset have already written on that, you learn. Employing very different methodologies from each other, this is quoting Magnusson at 170, Gur and Bousset nonetheless arrive at a similar conclusion, accounting for the anomalous uses in the sonnets by positing a greater preference for thou in poetic as opposed to socially inflected contexts. Basically, what's being suggested is that in the first movement of the sonnets, a high poetic register overrides the social specification of pronouns. In other words, right? So what we would expect would be to move one way, but because the poetry is so high, it overrides. So rather than being just social, the sonnets are poetic before social, and so the poeticness overrides them. That is the answer that Gur and Bousset give. The end. Should we write our essay now? No, because actually the essay we would write now would be the essays that Gur and Bousset already wrote, and we don't want to be redundant with what they wrote. So we should arrive at that in the reading of our sonnets. We discovered that actually what we've come up with so far is not as innovative as we thought. While it is notable to see that Shakespeare's uses of thou and you are specific and that they engage with social level, but they engage in an unexpected way, and that unexpected way cuts across received understandings of how early modern English works. That's really interesting, but it's been done by Gur and Bousset. So if you're doing your research, you have discovered here that it's not innovative. Why don't you just return to the text? Wait a minute. I would say, right, I'm pretending to be the student. Gur and Bousset already have written that essay. I don't want to be redundant, so let me check their argument against my own close reading. Wait a minute. I disagree. There's the first D with Gur and Bousset. You see, the social specifications of pronouns, and this is quoting Magnusson, that Shakespeare registers, I think it's Magnusson 170 or 171, forgive me for not putting the page. The social specification of pronouns that Shakespeare registers so dynamically in his plays, not merely with the finely tuned interplay of pronoun, but with a wide range of other politeness and pragmatic markers, that doesn't line up. Shakespeare is writing high poetry in his plays too. And why would the first sonnets, the insulting ones, be in the ones in the higher poetic register, right? Actually, the opening sonnets are the most kind of insulting and intimate. Why would it be? That doesn't make sense. And so actually, if you do your close reading here, as Magnusson did, you discover that Gur and Bousset's model, which is supposed to account for the inapplicability of the power solidarity model to Shakespeare's sonnets, also isn't applicable. Not really. It doesn't really account for Shakespeare's nuanced use of familiarity in the sonnets and elsewhere. So I guess we need to go back to research. Boop. And this is what we come up with, right? This is the articulation of the disagreement that Magnusson has with Gur and Bousset. I'll just read it to you. Against Gur and Bousset's claims that the language of sonnets 1 to 12 evokes a high poetic register, which is the reason that they give for why it goes against expectation for social register, and against formalist critic Helen Wendler's similar view that social context and historical specification are stripped away in lyric poetry to make the speaking I voiceable by anyone, I would argue that Shakespeare, the consummate dramatist, right, so this is Magnusson disagreeing with prior writing via her own close reading. I would argue that Shakespeare, the consummate dramatist, writes sonnets in which he means it to matter who is speaking to whom and in what situation. Reading the sonnets with attention to the early modern dialogue scripts they evoke and re-accent helps to illuminate the historic specificity of the roles and relationships being negotiated, together with the interest of their related structures of affect. These sonnets make a demand on the interpreter to situate the dialogic interaction. Shakespeare, the dramatist turned poet, innovates by creating the private thought of his speaker out of the materials of socially situated dialogue. For literary studies, finding the dialogue scripts should help, and we'll talk about what dialogue scripts means in a moment, should help illuminate the important interplay between Shakespeare's verbal artistry and sociohistorical contexts. It's not just one overrides the other, there's an interplay. For linguistics, it should hold out a caution against oversimplifying the history of contexts in using historical texts, whether literary or cultural documents, as evidence. Okay. Essay done. And that would be a great undergraduate essay. Wait a minute. I've never articulated a close reading, says this. Hold on, am I doing this right? Yes. Okay, yes. Okay, wait. Sorry. Wait. Let's just go back to the research first, because I've never articulated a close reading based on historical context before, we might say. Is there anything, says the undergraduate reader, and this is of course an ideal undergraduate reader, is there anything out there methodologically that might help me understand how to articulate the kind of inquiry I'm doing here? How do I understand the usage of a word based not only on a broad linguistic change, but on the specifics of social context? Oh, you find out, doing your research potentially for the first time, there's a whole field. It's called historical pragmatics, which is dedicated to the study of past utterances' dependence for meaning on context, etc., which hasn't adequately answered the question that I have about Shakespeare. So if I'm looking for social context for Shakespeare, I should ask what texts, and remember, just to make clear, by the way, this is me reconstructing what an undergraduate's process might be in arriving at the kind of sophisticated professional grade inquiry that Magnusson is doing. Obviously, this is a very sort of constructed, ideal situation, but it is one to strive for, right? I'm not saying that you have to be able to pull this out of nowhere when you're writing on Red Bull in the middle of the night, which you should be doing, by the way. I'm not saying that Magnusson's work is reducible to undergraduate writing. It is at the height of her field. But I am trying to articulate some of the process that could lead to this to show how powerful this back and forth between close reading and research can be. So I'm taking on that voice and I'm sort of writing that here. So let's go back to what the undergraduate is saying. So the undergraduate says, I've never articulated a close reading based on historical context before. Is there anything out there methodologically that might help me? And that reader comes to historical pragmatics. That reader says, if I'm looking for social context for Shakespeare, I should be asking what texts, according to historical pragmatics, what texts on language he and his social circle would have been talking about. This is a way of consulting texts widely. Let me read around more in present-day studies of Shakespeare and see what they say. Baldwin and Wilson and Booth write at length about Erasmus's De Conscribendis Epistolis as a source for themes, metaphors, and motifs in the sonnets. It's a major source. I wonder. Let me look at the Erasmus. Aha! Erasmus in the De Conscribendis Epistolis also addresses his frustration with two vos forms of address. So Erasmus is writing about specifically the thing I'm talking about. And we know Erasmus is, DCE will call it, to be a source for the sonnets. But none of Baldwin, Wilson, or Booth say anything about that. I should deepen what they have done. Because despite thorough discussion of the connections between Erasmus and the sonnets, no one has looked into the linguistic pragmatic connections yet, though both texts engage playfully with the thou-you distinctions. Right? Oops, sorry. What the heck? Technology. So, right, I've reconstructed a very, very specific, thorough research process here, but you see, this is sort of embodying the consult widely part of innovation. This imaginary reader, who is somewhere between you and Lynn Magnusson, has realized that the very sophisticated critique that she has already formed is being formed in relation to fields that she's not familiar with yet, so she has familiarized herself with those fields, and she has also gone to the trouble of trying to reconstruct Shakespeare's social circle's understanding of language by looking at some of the more influential texts that Shakespeare is reading and looking at what prior scholars have written about the relationship of those texts to the sonnets. So she's formed a really full bibliography here. Is she done? Of course not. Boop, close read. She takes all that back and now admits the Erasmus into her range of close reading. Now she's close reading two sets of texts, the sonnets and the Erasmus, and she finds, wait a minute, okay, slow it down. As she says on 177, nothing Erasmus says here about Latin usage in his time necessarily translates into any application to pronoun use in early modern English. So the speaker, the reader in theory is saying, I don't think my point is necessarily strong enough as it stands to demonstrate linguistic pragmatic connections between the two texts. Let me look deeper through close reading of both the Erasmus and the sonnets to see if there are any others. So she does. OMG, there are so many others. In doing this deep reading, which she got to by bouncing close reading off research, off close reading, off research, off close reading to research, now she's looking more closely at the Erasmus and the sonnets, and she finds that the connections that are right over and above were deepening, right, or below, were deepening what Booth and others have written about Shakespeare already. We know that the sonnets are influenced in terms of themes, motifs, etc., by the Erasmus, but just the linguistic / pragmatic mutual similarities, there are so many, and those so many break down into 5 categories. So Magnusson makes it her business to identify and break down those 5 categories. The imaginary reader says, look, now I can make a strong case, if I am really conscious of my logical rigor here, not for the direct influence of one text or another, right? Resemblance and connection do not prove influence of one text on another, but rather I can make a case for the shared sense of how to conduct this kind of conversation. And you can look into the breakdown of all of these 5 categories in the Magnusson yourself, but suffice to say that all of these similarities in how language is treated suggest a shared sense between Erasmus and Shakespeare of how to conduct the kind of conversation that the sonnets stage. The imaginary reader says, that seems to me at the heart of how historical pragmatics can apply to texts like the sonnets. They are literary examples of dialogue. They are a dialogue. The sonnets are presented as one half of a dialogue. But in being so, they are templates for what dialogue can look like. They're both influenced by and influencing the social fabric in which they are woven. There's no term for that. I haven't found any in my reading. I guess I'll invent one. I'll call them dialogue scripts. Okay, I must be done now. Now I'm ready to write. Wait. Just to be sure. Boop. Because why isn't there a term for this? Why haven't historical pragmaticists, historical pragmatics as a field, noticed this before, the thing I just described? I think it's time to destabilize, to look at the field itself and to sort of, the metaphor that I use for this, if I can pause here, the metaphor that I use for this kind of destabilizing approach is, let's say you're looking at a specimen through a microscope. Science. Let's say you're looking at a specimen through a microscope and you see that there is a dot on the specimen. And then you switch slides and you see there's a dot on another specimen in exactly the same place. And then you switch slides and you see there's a dot on the next specimen in exactly the same space or the same place. The conclusion you must come to is that there's a dot on your microscope. You have to recalibrate or clean the tool you were using to look at the specimen to better understand both the tool and the specimen. That's what I mean by destabilize, right? Is to look at the field itself, is to look at the prior critics themselves as texts to analyze. And so this reader does and realizes the reason why historical pragmatics as a field has not noticed this before is because the field is founded on corpus-based studies, that is, masses of data, which would necessarily render the kind of micro-context I'm talking about, right, Erasmus and Shakespeare and their circles, invisible, essential as that kind of study is to the study of the sonnets. I mean, I don't want to make that claim without evidence. So let me go back and close read a little more. So I'm going to close read the critics now. And I do, or Magnusson does. Magnusson is in the privileged position of having been invited to speak on a panel about this by representatives of the field that has not adequately addressed this. So she pulls what I would call a baller move. I don't know how else to call it. It is awesome what she does here. Let's take a look, right? As Irma Tevet-Sainen and Susan Fitzmaurice have explained in Chapter 1, historical pragmaticians have joined the trend within the linguistic field towards large-scale corpus-based studies. Such empirical studies tend to test claims or hypotheses about language variation or change by comparing frequencies of particular linguistic features between one genre, text type, or register and another. Once one has settled on comparing poetry and drama, or sonnets and letters, other potentially relevant micro-contexts tend to drop out of sight. While language use in context is the sine qua non of pragmatics, that's what pragmatics is, language use in context. Nonetheless, pragmatics as practiced on this increasingly dominant empirical model for linguistic inquiry seems under pressure to reduce any lifelike plurality of contexts to a strictly limited set of variables. Indeed, this is the baller moment. The rubric for the MLA conference session on linguistic theory and text, evidence and interpretation, for which this paper was originally prepared. That is, she's close reading the invitation that she was sent, essentially, to write this paper. And she says, indeed, come on now, there, indeed, the rubric for the MLA conference session on linguistic theory and text, evidence and interpretation, for which this paper was originally prepared, quote, to conduct a conversation regarding the use of texts as evidence for theorizing interpretative processes as analytical procedures that remain robust when applied as routines rather than as subjective, highly contextual non-interpretations, was itself premised on the imperative to resist the messiness of contexts. Quantitative studies may appear to the literary scholar to pull against nuanced readings of literary texts like Shakespeare's sonnets, although James Fitzmaurice's chapter in this volume, arguing for a new philology rather than a new pragmatics within literary studies, makes a welcome effort to show their applicability, in his case, to a literary analysis of Margaret Cavendish's prose fiction. Now that is the kind of field-wide critique that we wouldn't expect in an undergraduate paper, but it is something that is theoretically accessible by it. You too. And of course, at a lower level is the wrong word, but at a more beginner level, you have every opportunity to destabilize the field in which you are entering. And so, I hope I've drawn attention here in the essay you're about to read, and again, this will all be fleshed out now in your reading of Magnusson, how Magnusson's work disagrees, deepens, and destabilizes. And at that point, she can hit the write essay button. This is her thesis statement. In this paper, I will make a case for what I call dialogue scripts, or culturally specific interaction genres, for interpreting the historical context of relationship within which competing linguistic forms, such as second-person singular thou and you, become legible and interesting to the literary critic. At the same time, I am suggesting that a tool like dialogue scripts, for interpreting literary and related cultural contexts with greater delicacy, has something of value to offer to linguistic pragmatics, as it tries to assess features within Shakespearean texts as evidence for its theories. For my primary example, my focus will be on thou-you shifts that have puzzled interpreters in Shakespeare's sonnets 1 to 20. I will argue that the surprising choice of pronouns of address is related to Shakespeare's imitation and transformation of a dialogue script for familiar relations found in some of Erasmus's educational writings, including the DCE. And so we get the excellent essay she writes. So I hope this has been a nice demonstration of the highest levels of disagreeing, deepening, and destabilizing that you can do. Remember, whenever you are citing a source, or citing a secondary source in your own writing, you should be engaging with it at one of these levels. We don't cite sources just to repeat what they said. That would be redundant. Rather, your essay, if it's going to be innovative, should be engaging with the sources to do these three things. So with that, go and read the Magnusson, having read the sonnets already. See how much light they shed, which is a lot. And we'll see you soon.